Is agriculture in a cyclical downturn or a structural realignment and reality? That's the discussion in this episode of The Business of Agriculture. Before we hop into this awesome topic, I want to tell you about my friends over at AgView Solutions. AgView Solutions specialize in helping farmers with transition planning, cost of production, strategic growth, biz opportunity analysis, and just overall improvements to your farm or agribusiness's bottom line, acting as an advisor. The team at AgView Solutions is comprised of consultants who also farm and run multiple businesses. They get it. Check out their service at agviewsolutions.com. They help farms in 25 states as well as Canada. They even do workshops that are tailored for ag businesses. You can find out more at agviewsolutions.com. That's agviewsolutions.com. Hey there, welcome to another fantastic episode of The Business of Agriculture. Got a great one for you today. I've got a returning guest. A couple months ago, I had him on, and he threw out the idea that we actually don't need more farms. We need fewer farms. We need to be larger and more consolidated. And boy, did that get people coming out of the rafters to carry on with their opinion. Anyway, we don't set out to come up with a controversial clickbait. We did actually have an economic perspective on that episode. Anyway, his name is Mark Severson. He's an Illinois farmer. He also runs a business called Forge Consulting, Advising. He helps clean up messes of agricultural operations when the banks are getting involved and they need expertise. Anyway, what we're talking about today, very simply, is the reality of where agriculture is. I'm talking about marketplaces. I'm talking about economics. I'm talking about the global situation as it pertains to American agriculture. Most of my followers are American. And I asked the question, is agriculture in a cyclical downturn, or are we in a structural realignment and reality? With this in mind, the subject came up about in November. The CEO of CoBank put on LinkedIn his question about cyclical versus structural. And I said, why don't you come on my show and talk about this? Well, he never responded. So just last week, Mark Severson puts a thing on LinkedIn about commodity markets. And he read an article from one of the ag trade journals that said, and he put it out there and said, if you are in the top 40%, if you're in the top 40% of grain marketers as a farmer, you might break even. And he said, for God's sakes, if you have to be in the top 40% to possibly break even, is it time to admit that we have some structural problems here? And I said, holy bananas, it's been on my whiteboard for 3 months now that I want to cover the situation of structural versus cyclical, and you just nailed it. So anyway, his name is Mark Severson. He's here. We want to start by defining the terms. So if somebody's listening to this and says, wait a minute, what the hell's the difference, Damian?
Absolutely. Well, first off, thanks I'd like to remark on the fact that I'm your second choice here. And so cyclical versus structural, and it's something that I think when you hear it, you automatically have an opinion on what those two things are, but it's good to go back and define the terms before we start talking about it. So cyclical means that when whatever process you're going in, it could be any business, we're talking about ag here, what you're doing in the operations and the way that they're running are doing the things right, and it's just a matter of the entire system has to do a reset and burn out some inventory or whatever it needs to do, but keep doing what you're doing. Eventually things are going to come back around. Every business has to deal with some sort of a cycle. If we're talking about a structural change, that means that what you're currently doing is no longer going to work in the future, and the system is not going to change, so now you have to change, right? So that's how I would define those two things. And in ag, eventually, people will say it's cyclical, ag's always cyclical. If ag is going to stay in this same spot that we're right now in for the next 20 years, right? Well, then you could say it's cyclical because eventually things will turn around, but you're not going to survive that long, right? So that means there's something underlying the market that's telling you to change, and the operations need to change to be able to handle that change.
I still like the word cyclical, by the way, although when you call it a cycle and then you then revert to cyclical, it does make you wonder if cyclical is not the right term. So regardless, let's go ahead and go into this just for the person that says, hey, Damian, I love tuning to your stuff. I'm only average at the economics. Okay. What we love about this show, we always simplify everything down to why it matters to you. You work in the business of agriculture, and you're saying, okay, what the hell does this all mean to me? Right now, it's the year 2026, March of 2026. We are recording this, Mark and I, the end of March. And what we know is there's some commodity price run-up going on right now because of the problems in the Middle East. It seems to be based on a situation like oil, etc. Those tend to be very characteristic of what you'd call cyclical moves, right? Supply got disrupted, so then demand remained the same or tried to remain the same. And when supply gets cut by 20% and demand remains the same, what's that mean? There's pricing. And this could also then be in our business. We produce stuff. It takes a year to produce a lot of our crops, although there's some crops that you do twice a year, whatever, let's just say. And so to give you the background of what we're talking about on the cyclical is the beef cycle, much longer, because you've got this, and it's been historic forever. What we learned about the beef cycle is that you get overproduced to where there's way too many cows, and then every year a cow has a calf. And then you have this amount of supply and demand remains the same. So then what happens is there's a sell-off into that, and it creates a very low price cycle for a long time while a bunch of cows are going to market, and they continue to sell them into a losing profitability arrangement because they say, why the hell would I keep more cows? I can't make any money on them. So they keep selling them, thereby bringing the supply up while demand remains the same. So it's even getting worse. And then all of a sudden we hit this bottom where there's no cows, no calves. It takes a 9 months gestation cycle, 15, 16 months to feed that calf. So you're talking 2 years before a new calf can become a steak on your plate. And all of a sudden they've sold and sold and sold because they weren't making any money. And then all of a sudden there's no beef. Holy shit. We need more beef. Well, now it takes years for that to ramp up. So the cycle in beef is a much different one than, say, oil you can pump out of the ground, which can happen in the next 6 weeks. But the point is, everything in commodity production, they talk about cyclical, and agriculture, Mark, is not just cyclical. We tend to be counter-cyclical. That's another thing from the ag economics. And Main Street is doing very well. If Main Street's doing really well, the stock market's up and their housing value is good and their jobs are good and there's low unemployment, a lot of times during those periods of Main Street up cycle, ag is in a down cycle. So we're not just cyclical historically. It's been counter-cyclical to Main Street. It's also been varying degrees of cyclical within the different categories of ag. Beef in a different longer term ups and downs, chickens shorter, et cetera, et cetera. So there, I just kind of want to throw that there. Is there anything I missed?
So like I would add, so if you're talking about the ag production side, not the cattle side, what you're talking about is how, we're making decisions in year one about how we're going to grow in year two, and that grain is going to hit the market and how we're going to merchandise that in year three. And so in a 1 year process, you're always talking about 3 different crop years that you're working on, right? So we have to make decisions on something that we're going to sell 2 years down the road. And that's what makes this long cycle that you're talking about. Beef cattle have an even longer cycle, right?
And so your situation, and again, and everything can be different. And then some, you could argue that in many ways, some categories within agriculture don't suffer the cyclical burn as much as others. Chicken, when consumption continues to go up, in America, we're consuming about 100 pounds of chicken per American per year. Around the time I was born, 50 some odd years ago, we ate about 1/3 of what we do now. So when you have increased demand, that's where Mark and I are going to go with this. When you have a constantly increasing demand of something, you tend to have less down cycles or even none, right? Because you're in the situation where if demand continues to go up, you just keep producing more and more and more to fill that. So therefore, this is where we're going with this, dear listener. The last 20 or so years, really since about the year 2000, we've had a little bit of cyclical burn, a little bit of cyclical indigestion for us, but in general, we've been mostly up. We could produce just about anything and make more of it this year than we did the year prior and get bailed out because of this phenomenon known as China. 1.4 billion people whose economy 10 times itself during that time frame, and I might be exaggerating, 5 times itself probably during that time frame. That tends to negate the historic cycle, which would be maybe for 5 years or 3 years or 7 years or whatever. And now the question we're asking, because of the world being a different place, are we no longer cyclical? We're structurally different. And this is a realignment, possibly a reality, and possibly stagnation. That's the question.
So I'd like to add 2 layers to that to make it even more complex. So it's not one or the other, right? And you kind of said that there, that you're always having a structural effect going on and always having a cyclical effect going on. But what you just talked about, how we had this increased demand, that was structural. That was a structural change. We had a cyclic effect going on, propagating inside that up demand curve. But when you start adding on ethanol mandates or China buying or something like that, that changed the structure of the entire market. Yeah. And we continue to ramp up, and the cycle happened within that, right? But what we're talking about now is, okay, if the structure doesn't change, is there a cycle where we're just staying at the same spot and it goes up and down a little bit because we have demand and supply keeping up with each other? Or is the structure now, instead of ramping up, like a China economy, always ramping up, is now the structure starting to ramp down structurally? And I think that's what we're trying to get at in this talk, right?
Yeah. Well, let's face it. Why the cycle had its ups and downs was because marketplace forces changed based on what was happening. So in other words, ag was in an upcycle because production costs were contained and demand increased. So the upcycle was, hey, we're making money, so then let's continue to produce into that. And then no matter what it is, I used cattle before, but it could be anything. It could be canola. It could be, sunflower seeds, whatever. Oh, crap. We've overproduced now. So there's going to be some pain while we go through some financial losses because we overproduced way too much in front of what the consumption was. And now we're going to adjust. And the way we adjust is, oh, crap, I'm not going to plant any sunflowers this year or canola or whatever that thing is because there's no market. So the marketplace then essentially always is the reason for the cycle, that ups and downs. And usually it tends to take a few years, right? So there's that issue. What I'm going to question is, while there still are cyclical forces because of the supply and demand and productivity that we do, et cetera, the fundamentals of what we have always worked in are different now. And that's what I think that's weird.
And it's not just people having blinders on and blindly going forward. We have a very long history of that structural increase always being there. We were used to the fact that what the world was demanding of production was more at whatever cost, just figure out how to get more. And now we're moving into a world where, one, we're not the only provider of crops anymore, right? We have a global level competitor who is always adding acres. And that is a structural change, right? That's not cyclic. That's going to be there. If they did it for 1 year and then they put rainforest back, well, that might be a little more cyclic. So that is a structural change. At the same time, we also have all of the markets that we were once counting on hitting a population crescendo and now saying we don't want as much of those products. If you have that big of a thing changing, that's not cyclic in the sense that we had good weather for 2 years and we've got too much supply in the system, we need to cut back, right? Weather effects where we have bad years and droughts, stuff like that, that's cyclical. That is 100% a cyclical thing that the market's trying to digest. That's not the same thing as the continent of South America.
So that is exactly where I'm going. So I guess the fun part of this is the answer to the question that we open with is both. We're still going to be cyclical. We still are going to have the situation where the producer looks around at the marketplace and says, I'm going to cut production of this thing because I just can't make money on it. And then demand, and then also don't forget there's consumer trend. There's the issue of spats. Like, again, we're talking right now, the Middle East is going to probably be still a mess for a while. It could be Ukraine, which is a 4-year thing. Those factors do influence cycles, but it might be temporary. And it also, a lot of times they influence a cycle, but not for as long because the rest of the world adjusts. And that's where the structural comes in. We are not the same world that we were 25 years ago with the rise of China. Today, obviously, China has risen. We also are not the same country we're post-World War II, when, honest to God, most of the developed countries were in Europe and were obliterated. So you've got those things. The structure now that I see that negates a lot of the cyclical pressures or cycles in agriculture, massive amounts of productive capacity in 19 other countries that really weren't online 30, 50 years ago. I'm talking about the Kazakhstans and Wazakstans and all the other stands, and then Brazil, Argentina, Australia, United States, Canada, whatever. And then also the technology. And then throw into that population has always increased, which got you through the bad cycle. That was one of your points that you made in your notes to me, Mark, was if you figure it's cyclical, well, this is a downturn right now. But by golly, I'll just go ahead and keep keeping at it and put my foot on that gas pedal, because when this cycle upturns in another 3 or 4 years, I'm going to have 1,000 more acres that I'm farming. I'm going to have all of my capital, improvements in place, and I can ramp up and capture the positives in this good cycle. That's been the historic playbook for agriculture in the United States.
And it's been a successful playbook, right? That has worked a lot of times. So people that are, my age, well, twice my age might be a bit strong, but my age plus some still change left over, that's all they've ever seen. That has been the marketplace over and over again. So how could you fault anyone for thinking that this is just cyclical? Apply the same expectations going forward, because we've never hit peak population on the global scale before.
No, and consumption always went up, because as long as the global economy was improving, then the human condition was improving. A little bit cleaner water, a little bit more money in their pocket, a little bit more food on their dinner plate, and we could just play right into that. So then the next cycle was predicated on economic expansion at the global level. Keep my foot on the gas pedal, because we'll be a little skinny here for the next couple of years, but the cycle's going to turn around. And I would argue that's not going to be the case, and we'll get into the reasons why. All right, if you are looking for a real edge, you are a producer in this business, and you say, I'm spending a lot of money on my crop inputs, I need to maximize them, why don't you look at Nano Yield's products like Nano Pro? Nano Yield, been a client of mine for my speaking business a couple of years ago. I called them up and said, why don't you sponsor my show? And they said, absolutely, we need to do that, because not enough people know about our patented mineral-based nanoparticles. What they do, Damian, they go in the tank at 4 ounces per acre. So that's how it was explained to me. It's this product you put in your spray tank. You go across the field 3 times when you're in a production agriculture, and you make your inputs more valuable. So if you want to improve your weed control, you want to boost your fungicide performance, or get more out of the nutrients in your spray tank, Nano Yield technology can help you do that. It's an easy, affordable way that gives you basically an insurance policy on your crop input investment. Once you see it work, you will not want to spray without it. It's only 4 ounces per acre. You can learn more about the lineup at Nano Yield going to nanoyield.com. That's actually nano-yield. Nano, Nano-yield.com. Check out their grower testimonials on YouTube. All right. I just think that the structure is different now, because what always backed up the idea of a good cycle is coming is no longer the fundamentals. And that's why I think global fundamentals change this. And why did I say that? Too much global capacity with all these other countries. The fact that they are hungrier than the United States, more desperate economically. Generally, you talk about Brazil, land values are 1/3 what they are here. They're not going to take their foot off the gas. So we're over here in a different scenario. We keep our foot on the gas. It's like playing chicken with somebody that is suicidal to begin with. And that's the problem with the idea that structurally it's a different globe than it has been for all of the other cycles that we went through.
It absolutely is. And I think the way that I would try to look at it differently is that ag has been on the highway going 75 miles an hour with 4 lanes open, right? And you didn't have to be that precise. In fact, the world didn't need you to be that precise. It was just about cover as much distance as you can. And by that, I'm metaphorically talking about production, bushels, right? Now we're going into a single lane bridge that we're crossing, and slowing down so you don't hit the guardrails or something like that, and being very precise on your driving is the right response. And the question now is that the way you need to drive going forward, or are we just getting through that bridge and we're going to be right back on the highway going full speed? And I don't think that if you look into the marketplace and look at predictors, you're not going to find a lot of predictors saying this is just a short-term thing that's going to go away, and you're going to be hitting, probably 80 to 90% reasons that this is a sustained long-term approach. And if you don't adjust your driving habits or farming habits for that, and start managing in a way that you're getting quick feedback and you're hitting just your right numbers, you're going to end up going off the rails, right? And you're not going to be around should the future stay a one-lane bridge.
Well, and the thing is, this is in no way being negative. People tune into the Business of Agriculture show realize I'm as big a supporter of this American ag as you will find. The thing is, I just can't look at anything in this world, any factor, I should say. I know thing doesn't mean anything. Any factor that doesn't indicate to me that the structural realignment is here, because again, every other country is looking for imports. Right now, also, I make this case in my live audiences. I think that protectionism is going to be here for a while. All right, you got the Straits of Hormuz, but it could have been something before that. We talked about that with my fertilizer episode. Before that, it was China. Before that was you couldn't get shipping containers. Before that, just name this deal. And those are issues that you're saying, Damian, that's always been something. The difference now is it starts to point more and more countries to where, and this is not Donald Trump, this was already going on, to where they're going to say, I want to be more protectionist. Screw the rest of it. Hungary has been this way forever. Hungary doesn't want immigrants. Hungary doesn't want their language to go away. Well, all of a sudden, a bunch of European countries are going to start doing that. Germany has been protectionist on their cars for 40 years. They want to sell Volkswagens and BMWs and Audis. And so what do? They make sure as hell that GM, Chevy F-150s from Ford don't get dropped off over there. So those are fundamental changes that go away from globalization. Mark, I think that when you start looking at the structural realignment, it has a lot to do with protectionism and a call for deglobalization. That's not good for American agriculture, which is really into the idea that we're going to keep producing stuff and shipping it overseas.
Well, I think part of the problem is, and you hit on that, is that people say that if you look at production and demand going down, then that is a fundamental threat to American agriculture, and you are negative by saying that, right? It doesn't have to be saw that way. It's only seen that way because we have been, you could say reliant, you could say addicted to an ever-increasing demand cycle for the last 30, 40 years. Yep. But that is not required for every business in the world doesn't operate under an endless supply cycle or demand cycle, right? So
endless demand increase
endless demand increase. Yeah.
Generally, they all want to. I mean, if you are the CEO of General Motors or Ford, or name the American auto companies, or name Intel, name any, Amazon, whatever. The idea that you would love is there's some population growth and there's some economic growth, and with that comes sales growth, which brings revenue growth. Which brings more production, which for Amazon means more warehouses, which for ag it would mean more acres, or maybe the same amount of acres, but more bushels per acre, or more pounds per steer per feedlot in Kansas, more apples per tree, or more trees per acre in Washington State. All those things were fantastic. But I think that played into an ag economy globally that is structurally realigning before our very eyes, and probably has been for a while.
Well, it turns the problem into an engineering problem, which is where people generally like to end up. They want the problem to end up being, how do I just produce more and use more technology to do that? And it's simple because it's a clear goal that everybody can understand. And if that goes away, you're talking about a capital allocation problem. You're talking about a finance problem, and you have a lot more uncertainty you have to work with, right? Is that a fair assessment of that?
Yeah. Well, so here's the thing that a lot of people are going to say, all right, Damian, I'm not sure I buy into this. What should I do? What should I know? Well, it depends on where you are. If you're in the production side, and then what are you producing? We've referenced everything from apples in Washington to beef in Kansas to corn in Illinois, whatever. And then you can also say, what if you're on the company side? Like I said, I appreciate the fact that you're my second choice. The CEO of an agricultural finance entity was posing this thought out there, and I don't even know how it was a question, because I'm looking at these things for the last decade saying a lot of the old rules don't hold up. And you got to be careful, Mark. I'm old enough to remember the dot-com boom in the 1990s. And I remember seeing Warren Buffett get interviewed, and he said, the fundamentals of these dot-coms don't make any sense. How is some dude has a balloon.com worth $1 billion when they haven't even got a product or sold anything. And then you'd hear the 34-year-olds Wall Street types get on CNBC and say, Warren Buffett's a nice old man. It's time for him to retire. This is a new economy. That's the words in 1999. New economy. Things are different this time. So I'm careful to do that. Things are different this time. It's a new economy. But I'm also telling you, things are different this time because we are in record amounts of demand. The globe is eating more calories than it ever has. But we also are in record production. And our production is going up by a greater percent than our consumption. And I keep pointing it out there. The United States is still the dominant economy. We're not necessarily the dominant agricultural economy anymore. Probably innovation, yes. But there's a lot of things that are structurally different when you look at this globe.
There is, and something that, as we've been used to this upcycle mentality, things like R&D have basically unlimited funds because it's an automatic win. You just want to produce more, so you increase your R&D funding. So if you're on the company side, the finance side, any production side, doesn't matter where you are, you haven't really had a lot of opportunities to practice adjusting to the price signals as they come in, right? So you haven't really had a lot of times where you're saying, you know what, like I'm going to use exactly this amount of fertilizer because at this price and this production expectation, this is the optimal time to do it. It's been simply just more. As long as more works, it's fine. As long as you're on that highway, you don't have to be perfectly between the center lines. You just have to keep going fast. And if this is truly a structural change and not just a cyclic change, which it's as I'd like to say again, we are both, right? Both of these things are happening all the time. If this is truly a structural change, now our farm management has to be able to keep up with the fact that it's not just about how many bushels you produced. Mm-hmm. It's about what is the margin you maintained while you produced them. And that takes a whole lot more management than just more bushels.
I want to address what is clear. Yes, I want to address what is clearly going to be the naysayer, or the I don't care, critic, questioner. It's fine. It's fine. You're not hurting our feelings. You tune into this show to think. You tune into this show because it's not the usual same old mantra that you've heard at all the ag media and ag conference you've been to. So I'm sure there's somebody going to say, Damian, you know what? You talk about you're old enough to remember this. Well, from 1981 until roughly 2000. A 20-year span. Were we in a cycle? Were we in a cyclical downturn? Or were things structurally different? Because things came back from that. Well, there you're basically asking the same question that I asked when I came up with this topic, when I read the CEO statement on LinkedIn, and then I got Mark on here. I'm having the same question myself. Was that a cycle? Or was it like I more really think it was? 81 was the canary in a coal mine of the absolute destruction of American agriculture, the ag crisis. I lived through it, telling us that we are now moving into a different structure. And we got bailed out by the China phenomenon, where it then gave us license to do what we love to do. Tell ourselves, hey, you know what? That was just a bad blip. Hey, Mark, that was just a bad cycle. That was just a downtrend cycle for 20 damn years. But hey, let's put our gas on that pedal and let's go ahead and do it. And since the year 2000, we make 70% more corn, 50+% more soybeans, about 50% more pork. I can go through every commodity that we make more of in the last quarter century. And the difference is, with the rise of China came the rise of the global economy, which frankly was kind of all the same thing. Rapid globalization, putting our factory production over there, cheap consumer goods made it so there's more money for consumers to spend, and this thing went crazy. Not to mention interest rates for much of that time were historically low, and in the last 10 of the last 15 years were so low it was almost free, which again fuels an inflationary growth of the entire global economy. And then you can say, so what you're telling me, Damian, is The 20 years from 1981 till the year 2000, that was a cycle. And now, then we had the 2000 till 2023, another 22, 3 years that was a big up cycle for the most part. We know that 2014 to 2020 was a little bit of a blip of a bad time. Either the cycles have gotten longer or what we saw the last 40 years wasn't really a cycle. It was structural, and we've removed cycles, or at the very least, we've made them so much longer plays that, to Mark's point, the idea you're going to put your foot on the gas and just wait another few years, maybe you have to wait another 20. So if you're my age, you're saying, the hell with this.
Well, and to be specific, there's a difference between a down cycle being, we didn't make much this year, and a down cycle being, we lost a shitload this year, right? we are not going to make it much longer.
Yeah. We got one more year of losses like that, and then we're probably actually liquidating. We're bringing in fortune advising and figuring out how to get the hell out of this.
And if it's so bad that, if the down cycle is so bad that 2 or 3 years is going to crush you and put you out of the game, that's not cyclical anymore, right? Like that's not what that means. Yeah. Cyclical means, you didn't make much money for a couple of years, but then it swung back up and now you made good money. And on the net long, you're probably at that same 5 to 7% or range or whatever you did. That's not what this is, right? This is 3 to 4 years now in a row where you are zero or losing like crazy, depending on the government subsidy that you're pulling. Right.
And obviously, and depending on what your working capital looks like and how much you can leverage, et cetera. Yeah. And that's a big one. And what's interesting is ag, more than most any other businesses, certainly more than most businesses that are just run by like a guy and his wife, are willing to have those years. The where it's like, we lost $250,000 last year. We lost $500,000 last year, and we're gonna probably lose about $500,000 again this year. Go and tell my suburban neighbors out here in Arizona that you're going to endeavor in something where you've just lost $500,000 to $1 million over the last 2 years, and they're going to say, "Jesus, get out of this."
Yeah, right. I mean, like look at anybody who is watching this that's not a farmer and say, how long would you keep doing your job if the paychecks stopped coming? And if you're in banking, if you are in car sales, I don't care what it is, if you stopped getting a paycheck, it would probably take you all of 2 weeks before you would just say, I'm not doing this anymore, right? And you would be rational to do so. I would not negate that. And a lot of production goes on blind faith because they've got such long cycles and they are used to these downturns, or at least the concept of what they think a downturn is, or they have such huge balance sheets backing them up that they can ignore the signals and they don't really see it. The kids still have presents under the tree on Christmas Day, whether or not they made money that year because they're pulling from equity. And if you're working at Kohl's at the checkout counter, when that paycheck stops showing up, that shows up that next week. Like, you do not have groceries that next week, you're going to react to that cycle much easier and faster, right?
So I want to get into our recommendations and where we actually do see things going for that horizon that is everybody that's listening to this. I mean, remember, if you're 36 years old listening to this, you are looking at the next 30 years, and you're like, damn, Damian, what if you're telling me that 20 of those 30 years are going to be like it was from 81 to the year 2000? Well, maybe not. Hey, I talk a lot about the Asians of agriculture. That's my big thing when I go on stage and speak about innovation, inflation, regulation, in this case, consolidation, whatever. But if you're looking for a way to alleviate your frustration, you need to look at my friends at Tidal Grow. Tidal Grow makes a lineup of products that are bio-based solutions to deliver measurable yield performance that give you a return on your investment. Tidal Grow Agri-Science. They did a field day at my farm in Indiana last year. We're going to do it again this year. I put out trials. Saw some pretty cool results on their stuff. And the neat thing is they've got the environmental play as well as the economic play. They use upcycled seafood byproducts to precisely formulate powerful plant nutrition and crop protection chemistry. That's right. It's seafood byproducts. This is not seaweed. It's seafood byproducts. It stinks terribly. God, it's awful. But you know what? It works. This is real science powered by nature. It's built to positively impact the bottom line on your farm. You do not have to change anything. It works with your crop protection and all the stuff you put on your fields right now. It already works with that. You don't have to change anything. It's just about getting more out of what you are doing and alleviating the frustration. Go to titlegrowag.com. That's title, like a big wave of water. Grow, like what you do when you get bigger. Ag, titlegrowag.com. Tell them Damian Mason sent you. All right. I wasn't being in any way like wanting to bash on anybody's future ideas or worse yet, rain on their parade. But what if the cycles aren't 7-year beef cycles or usually like hogs up and down, and it usually goes like every year, 6 months, year and a half. What if the big general overarching message here is, yeah, we might still be cyclical, but because of the fundamental differences about the globe, stagnating population, which is going to be coming, economic expansion is not going to be what it was in places like the developing world or China, which is now no longer an emerging market. They're almost a mature economy at this point. So those things make it so that instead of just gearing up for the 3-year cycle, maybe it's kind of like it's kind of like the battle versus the war. What do you think as a 42? What a 42-year-old producer. What do you think?
Oh, that's rough. I am much younger than that. I am only 39. So thank you very much.
I remember you're somewhere. I knew you were somewhere around there.
The decision is really a matter of two things. Is like, what can you stomach and how big is the payoff going to be? So if we have a world where this is a 20-year cycle, and you are going to be making near nothing for, say, 10 years of that cycle, you better be doing very well in that back half to make up for this. So if you think that 30% margins is coming in production agriculture for that second half of the cycle,
right,
then yeah, and you can survive it. Like, sure, maybe this first 10 years is something that you can live through. But if you think that you are holding on to 0% margins and then you're going to make 5%, on that second 10, and now you're at 2.5%, like that's not sustainable. That's not something that you can do. And if you can act on faith all you want, but that's something that your family's actually going to feel one day, right?
I think that first off, that's the brilliant part. And this is not just for producers. If you are a supplier, if you're whatever you do in this industry, whatever you do in ag, and if you're feeling this burn that you think is cyclical, good, fantastic. We need people to stay in this industry because it's pretty damn important, right? We feed feed, clothe, and fuel a 8 billion person planet. That's cool, but it's just kind of like when we went through all this tumult in the stock market, and then my investment guy calls up and says, the next year he's like, "Hey man, things are pretty good. We had a good year. We returned 23%." I said, "We returned 23% this year on my portfolio. I was down 14% the year before that. So we're at a net mixed average here. We gained about 9%. That's 4.5 a year, buddy." So that's about like the situation on production or whatever business you want to endeavor in. If you're going to have years where you break even at best, or worse yet, you're dipping into savings, your spouse is, the business is chugging along at an absolute break even or a loss, and thank God your spouse has a job or you kept money back or whatever. We've all been there. Trust me, I've had years that were absolute dog shit in what I do for 32 years. And you look back and say, well, man, you killed it this year. Yeah, it's record revenue. I'm like, good. Because 2 years ago, I was calling that investment guy saying, yeah, I need to yank some money out of there because my revenue doesn't even cover my living. My revenue kind of just covers my expenses. So that's the tough part. If this cycle goes on for a long enough time, is there enough gravy at the end to justify this ulcer you're going to have for the next 5 years? That's a very important question.
Well, and then you look at the last 10-year cycle. If you say 2012 is the start of a cycle to 2022, all right, like 2022, 2021, you probably made a lot of money in ag, right? But did you go back and divide that money you made up over the entire 10-year cycle and see what the long average was? Or did you just say, we made a lot of money this year, it's going to be just like this every year after this, let's roll, right? And that most people have probably learned that lesson already once, so that's not something you really got to delve into, but it is a perspective you have to remember that it is a long game. And all of that income, I had a conversation with a banker once when I let go of some acres, and he's like, "Yeah, but like when you let go of those acres, you have costs. Your fixed costs get divided on even less acres. Like you shouldn't do that." And I said, "Sure, but the profit gets divided on more acres too, right?"
Yeah,
So it's the whole system here that you got to be accountable for. We're not just getting more scale for scale's sake.
So I'm not the financial advisor to farms. Like our buddy Jared Creed does this. He's in my Business of Ag Success group. And by the way, if you're not a member, you really should be. Mark is a member of it. It's $99 a month, and we get together every other Friday on a Zoom call. I bring in guest presenters, and we talk intelligently about issues impacting the world's most important industry. It's very, very solid. You should look into it. Your company will probably pay for it as a continuing education. Well, Jared's in that business of advising farms. And that's not my job. But if you ask me right now, say, all right, I tuned your show. I'm at the production level. What should I be thinking? I would be thinking, Mark, the old rules maybe don't apply. That thing about keeping your foot on the gas, it's like you said, it's generally been good if you were older, because that's usually worked. Get through the slump of another couple of years. The thing you also look at, are we going to have political support and political clout? I shot one of my commentary videos about that on my hike in the desert this winter. This is probably, you don't like to think this, but we're in a long-term bad cycle, maybe 3, 5. I think it's probably potential 10 years because of the glut of surplus and also protectionism on the global scale of countries protecting and being more resistant to trade. So if we're there for the next decade, are the United States taxpayers going to, and the United States government, backstop American agriculture to where you are at least break even? And then after that 5 or 10 year discussion or challenge, downturn, stagnation, is there enough money, to Mark's point, to then say, well, yeah, we got backstopped by the government and we made it so we were break even for 10 years. But by God, now look at us. Now we're making, if you're making like 6% on your return, that means you average that out again. That doesn't amount to much over the years. So that would be my thought. I don't think the old rules apply quite as much. I really don't. I don't think the old rules apply on keeping your foot on the gas, because I think we're going to be in a longer structural realignment. And it's
so then the question becomes, if it is structural, how do I make different decisions? That same producer that's coming to you metaphorically is going to say, like, how am I supposed to make decisions? What does that even mean? Right? So if this is cyclical, then you power through, right? Like you just stay aggressive, you gain acres because other people are giving them up, and you keep producing as much as you can, and you fill those bins up, and then assume that one day it's
Illinois terms, it could be the same thing. You buy another apple orchard, you pick up another blueberry patch or whatever that thing is. You just keep your foot on the gas and say, I'm going to accumulate assets. I'm going to continue to be a massive producer. I'm going to capitalize on whatever government programs there are in terms of insurances or backstops or whatever. And that way, when we get through this, I come out of here and I'm rolling. And that has historically been what has happened.
Absolutely. Now, what if it's the other way? What if this is more structural? Because like I said before, I don't want to make this sound binary, right? It's not either structural or cyclical. It is both of those things. If this is a structural trend that we are living through, and it is going to stay in this direction, then you have to start changing how your operation works. Because if the world will no longer change to accept your operation, then the operation will need to change to accept how the world's going to go. How do you change your operation to deal with these margins, this environment, these production expectations? That means you have to increase your management to be able to do that. Your management is not going to be as simple as produce more. Your management now has to say, under these current conditions, these prices, these expectations, these demands, how do I decide what to grow, when to grow it, how much to put into that, how much money do I have to have, how do I find the best money sources? All of these questions that we've been able to generally answer well, but not specifically answer any of them really well because we only have so much time and thought to put into it. The management has to grow to be able to make those decisions and be a specialist in each of these areas in order to protect The margin, which is what I talk about as much as the margin, is what we need to start focusing on. And that is what is going to save us if this is structural. If this is cyclical and it's going to be gravy again down the road, then yeah, you could probably stay going this the same way you are right now, and you don't need to scale your management because it's going to turn out okay. The argument I would make is that even if you just are hedging to say maybe this is structural, maybe this is different, and maybe I need to improve my management, that will always be good for you in the long term. Right? Like you are going to be able to not only weather this storm better, but you will be better on the other side of this, whatever it is. And it also is something that it's going to keep you there. You're going to actually be in existence on the other side of the cycle. Whereas if you are wrong and you choose to ignore the indicators and just keep doing what you're doing, you just won't be there on the other side of the cycle. Eventually the balance sheet will run out and the market will call you off, right?
So what about the company folks? I mean, a bunch of my listeners work in professional agricultural careers. And I guess then you got to ask the question, okay, if this is true that, again, like you said, it's not binary. By the way, we're binary. We didn't capture that whole thing about being non-binary, but it's not binary in that it's not either structural realignment or cyclical. It's going to be components of both. And you can say, Damian, that's always been the case. But again, I'm telling you that it's going to be more to the point than it's ever been because of protectionism on trade policy and because of rapidly declining birth rates, which means we can't fall back on the usual stuff. And the fact that for a long, long time, we had a whole bunch of hungry people in developing economies that we could figure out a way to ship them more stuff. That's not the case anymore. There's still hungry people on Earth, but they ain't got any money. And it's not likely that they're going to all of a sudden develop a China model economic boom. So here we are, glutted. So what
productions? Well, if I can add on to that, production is just one facet we're talking about. But those other companies that feed the production, they've had that same mindset too, right? Like every tech startup, every product, every one of the seed producers, their only thought is how do we produce more bushels? And when I have conversations with seed people, I say like, hey, you need to bring your R&D budgets back, because we don't need more corn. I need cheaper bags, right? I need that price to be communicated up. And they say, well, if we do that, then when this thing turns around, then somebody else is going to be growing more bushels and have better stuff. We can't take our foot off the gas. I'm not making that up. I have had that conversation multiple times.
Sure you have.
And it could be, I could be having that conversation with Helena or Corteva or Bayer or any of these places, and they would all have the same mindset. So it's not producers being stupid by any means.
No.
Right? It's everybody just has this same exact concept of how things have been for so long that you can't fault them for thinking this is the way.
Again, the term is vertical knowledge. Daryl Bricker's been on this show twice. He uses that term. He invented that term, as far as I know, to talk about the population thing. And he said vertical knowledge is that which you know it so well that it's not even questionable. Like the earth is round, water is wet, and ag is going to have a down cycle followed by an up cycle. Those are the damn things that we know it so well. And I'm saying maybe, but there'll be a tremendous amount of carnage to have that up cycle, which means we have to burn through supply. Acres have to go away. There has to be some global tumult to create the next up cycle, because it's not going to be that we just didn't have enough productive capacity. And again, we can talk about anything from cranberries to apples to Mark soybeans. It don't matter. It's really the same situation. So my advice then to the businesses, like you said, I've had the same discussion. Got an email. I can pull it up right now. And he said, Damian, when you come and do your speech for our company, doesn't matter what the company does, you're going to be speaking to our people. And, they've been kind of beat up right now because, as you know, ag's in a 2 to 3 year downturn. So I just want you to give them a little bit of hope that when this cycle turns upward again, and he put in there, and we know it will because it always has. Of course, he's 75 years old. And to his way of thinking, we know it will because it always has. And I remember I read that, and again, it fed me. It's why it's written on my whiteboard. Maybe it's not so cyclical as we want to keep saying. So if I'm a company person, maybe I start actually having this hard discussion of, to your point, do we need more bushels? Do we need more of this when we're feeding into this thing of an absolute global oversupply situation? And then what do these producers need? You could go to the machinery. They're going to say bigger, because what do machinery people like? Big. What do farm people like? Big. And so you can start asking the question, maybe the answer is figure out how it cheaper, cheaper,
Yeah,
smaller. Cheaper,
Yeah.
smaller, or better yet, a business model where I don't even have to own the stuff. That it's like Uber. I don't have to pay for the insurance and I have to own this damn $70,000 automobile. I just Uber. The answer to me is if we're in this structural realignment, which actually looks not it's certainly not going to be swinging from the rafters and saying, "Oh my God, this is amazing." I'm going to look at everything I can do to say, let's concentrate less on all that old stuff of more, bigger, bigger, and just look at how can we skinny it down.
Yeah, exactly. And if you could go back in time and have been a company that focused on building a car with no microchips in it, and COVID came around, right?
Yeah.
You would have been in a perfect spot, right? Because you would learn how to, this charge might not have as many whistles and dingers in it or whatever, but this thing could be made under any circumstances, right? And that is the ability not to always be bigger and more expensive has its own skills or not its own skills, its own benefits baked in. Same thing with the ag side. If you can figure out that, like, all right, maybe I can only produce a 150 bushel crop, but I can do it with almost no inputs. That is something that will be useful if this consolidation and reorganization kind of effect happens due to a structural change in the economy. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And I think that a lot of folks are dialing in here saying, yeah, you're right, Damian. I never thought of this. I just always assumed that things would improve. In general, they probably will. But I think the carnage is going to be worse. It might remind us of some elements of the 80s to get there. And granted, there's more significant government backstops than there were back in the early to mid 80s, but it could take that. I would say the other part of it is just be careful about what we've always known, right? We've always known that the cycle comes and the cycle goes. It probably will still have some components of that, but much of the drivers of the cycle are no longer fundamentally true.
And if you want to start thinking about the sense of how does America compete with South America, if that's the mind you look at as like they're competitors and we want to beat them, they are scaling hard. That is their model is about scaling and gaining acres and whatnot. And if you are reacting as a country to this situation and saying, we're not going to try to produce our way out of this, we're going to try to get really smart about our production, then one of those two countries is going to be on that highway train and hit a much harder consolidation point than the one that's already gotten disciplined on their agriculture, already got disciplined through the entire agricultural chain to say, hey, we don't need more bushels every year just to make this feasible. We can react to those pricing signals and change our methods to make as many bushels as you want, right?
And you keep using bushels, and I know that I'm a Midwest guy, and so is Mark, so it doesn't matter what corner of ag you work in. It's really the same story. It's about how many widgets. We love making widgets. We love making more widgets, and we found a boat to put them on, and I keep telling you that's changed. You've heard, this has been like, I know I'm the preacher that's still telling you, the same message every Sunday, but it's important for you to tune into this. The other angle on this is, in my observation, is that we look at this world and you say, Damian, all right, I still think it's cyclical. I don't think it's structural. I don't think the fundamentals have changed all that much. Here's one telling reason why I want you to consider what I'm saying. For decades, the United States of America was an agricultural net exporter compared to all the countries. For decades, we sold more crap. We sold more of our agricultural goods on the world market in dollars than we bought any agricultural goods back in here. That changed 5 years ago. No, it wasn't about Trump or Biden or fighting with. It was largely because commodity prices then started to come down, meaning we sell bulk commodities, oats, wheat, corn, not oats, wheat, soybeans, corn, whatever, cotton, rice. And we have an appetite in the United States of America for coffee and grapes and bananas and kumquats and avocados that we don't grow all those here in the United States. Some of them we can't even grow them here. Go and find yourself a banana field and let me know where it is. The point is, if that is not indicative of a structural realignment, the United States was a net exporter of agricultural goods. We had a positive trade balance in agriculture for decades, and we haven't for the last 5 years. Is that proof enough that there's a structural realignment going on, Mr. Severson? One indicator of a structural realignment?
It's an indicator. I don't know if it's the strongest one out there. I think that it is interesting, but I don't know that it is required that it has to be structural because that's happening. Right. I think the structural is really more so look at how many people are producing bushels of revenue. Look how much ag revenue is happening. Yep. It's happening outside of just this country. And the amount of appetite that it then has not changed and is not going up, not predictably going up. So could it be cyclical? Could it still be cyclical and us also be at a negative trade balance? That could happen. I think the margin compression probably speaks to it pretty well. Yeah. I think how sticky the input prices have been probably speaks to it pretty well. And I think the duration is starting to speak to it pretty well. I mean, if you were talking to me in 2024 and asked, is this a structural realignment? I'd be like, what? I mean, we're 2 years into this down cycle. No, like it could easily not be. Like I can understand losing money for a couple of years. I don't like it, but I could do it. This is getting a long time, right? And it doesn't have an end. So if it's we're looking at 6 or 7 years of no margin. Yep. That to me, in my personal opinion, that's what means this is structural. And that's what means it's time to start rethinking how we do this, or we're not going to be doing it any longer.
And the old timers are going to say, well, you're full of beans because I made it through the 80s and the 90s. And I'm going to tell you again, you better just realize that was based on the fact that during that time frame, we grabbed about 2 billion more humans on this planet. We made 2 billion more people who eat. And we had the economic engine of Asia, and largely Asia, and the rest of the developed countries kept on chugging also, that made it so that this all worked. It is fundamentally different now than it was in the late 80s and 90s. Then today it is different than it was then. So I get it. You can say, and I just had this question with a higher up with a large corporation last week. He said, I'm beginning to think that history is not the best predictor of the future when it comes to American agriculture. And I said, bingo, bingo, bingo. And that's where I am right now.
Yeah. And there's a story that a philosopher named Nassim Taleb always talks about, that a turkey living on a farm, every morning when it gets up, it has a farmer come out and feed. And so it has a entire year or two of history saying, like, that is always a good thing. And then on that last day, the farmer comes out and kills the turkey and eats it, right? So like, there's no amount of data points you can have to be 100% certain that you know what's going on, no matter how old you are and how many cycles you've seen. That doesn't mean that you are an expert and you will always know what's going on. Eventually, things can always go the other way. And neither Damian and I don't think, maybe Damian knows the future, but neither of us really know exactly what's going to happen. We're trying to frame this in a decision matrix that lets other people say, all right, here's what I think is going on, and how do I get ready to react to these things as they come along, rather than just rowing in the same direction and praying that things will turn out.
So, I did a theme, dear listener and viewer, where I kind of went down about family and transition and succession planning, and I did that with some of my commentary videos. If you don't watch my commentary videos, go to my YouTube channel. They're free. I put them on all my social media, on X, on LinkedIn, on Facebook, but you can also go to my YouTube channel, hit subscribe. It doesn't cost anything. You can watch this show there. And now the theme I'm going down a little bit is this exact road of history doesn't necessarily predict the future. And I'm rich on history, trust me. I'm agricultural history in particular, but I think we've got to look at where history did one thing and the future. Unfortunately, for 2 years, the farmer came out and gave grain to the turkey, and then that was historic. And guess what? The future, he came out with an axe and chopped the thing's head off. So I don't want you to get your head chopped off. He's Mark Severson. He's a farmer in Northern Illinois. He also has a business known as Forge Advising. I'd call it Forge Advising as a company that helps clean up financial messes for creditors that have farming clients that are experiencing some deep problems. Is that the accurate assessment?
That's an accurate assessment. And basically, our entire point is to help farmers and lenders look at farming as a disciplined business. That's all we do. We are trying to make you look at it just like every other company looks at their business.
Go to forgeadvising.com if you want to learn more. And also, if you want to join my Business of Ag Success Group, you can hear from me, Mark, and about 24 of our friends that are all ag professionals every other Friday on a Zoom call. You can sign up for that at DamianMason.com. Remember my sponsors, that's Tyler Grow, that's AgView Solutions, and that's Nano Yield. Till next time, he's Mark, I'm Damian. Thank you very much for tuning in and supporting this show. Now in its 9th year, getting close to 10 years, I think. Anyway, until next time, this is the Business of Agriculture. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Business of Agriculture, brought to you by my friends at AgView Solutions. I told you up front about AgView Solutions. They're an advisory group for agriculture professionals that can help you in your agricultural business and your farming operation. Maybe it's transition planning, analyzing your cost of production, strategic growth initiatives, discovering business opportunities and ferreting them out, overall improvements to your farm and your agricultural business. That's what they do as advisors. The team at AgView Solutions is comprised of consultants who also farm and run multiple businesses. They get it. You can check out their services at agviewsolutions.com. They help farming operations in 25 states as well as Canada. agviewsolutions.com. Check it out.